All right, well, welcome everyone to the launch of Protestant Social Teaching. We are delighted to have you here. My name is Ansi Kamel. I am an editor-at-large for our journal, Ad Fontes, and I'm one of the editors of the Protestant Social Teaching volume. We really are just so excited to see all of you here today. Just a few brief words before I introduce our speakers. The Davenant Institute exists to recover Christian wisdom for the contemporary church. So our work, we really try to bridge the gap between the academy and the church. And this book is one of our most significant forays to date into trying to communicate the riches of the magisterial Protestant tradition to contemporary Protestants and Catholics and Orthodox. We want this to be a book that is accessible to everyone, to kind of give a broad overview of what reformational commitments actually are and were on all of these issues of contemporary social import. So today the way we're going to proceed is we're going to have three contributors to the volume giving a brief overview of their chapters. Then we're going to open it up for discussion and questions, and there's a microphone here. And then following that, there will be a book signing. So we're going to speak. I'll introduce the speakers in the order that they're going to speak. So the first is Brad Littlejohn. He is the founder and president of the Davenant Institute and received his PhD from the University of Edinburgh. He also works as a fellow of the Ethics and Public Policy Center and has taught for several institutions, including Moody Bible Institute, Spokane, Bethlehem College and Seminary, and Patrick Henry College. He is, of course, a leading scholar of Richard Hooker and the English Reformation, and that's why we're called the Davenant Institute. After Brad, we're going to have Marc Livecche speak. He is the MacDonald Distinguished Scholar of Ethics, War, and Public Life at Providence. He is also a non-resident research fellow at the U.S. Naval War College in the College of Leadership and Ethics. Marc completed doctoral studies, earning distinction at the University of Chicago, where he worked under the supervision of the political theorist and public intellectual Jean Bethke Elshtain until her death in August 2013. His first book, The Good Kill, Just War and Moral Injury, was published in 2021 by Oxford University Press. And then following, we're going to have Jake Meador. Jake is the editor-in-chief of Mere Orthodoxy and is a writer and editor from Lincoln, Nebraska. His work has been published in First Things, National Review, Books and Culture, Commonweal, Plow Quarterly, Christianity Today, Front Porch Republic, and the University Bookman. He holds a BA from the University of Nebraska, Lincoln. And Jake, in addition to being a contributor to the volume, is also one of my fellow editors. So if you have questions about the editorial process later, you can help Jake with them. Don't ask me. Direct them to him. So without further ado, Brad, would you like to come give your remarks?
Thank you so much, Anzi. Thank you so much to Mark Tooley and Colin Bastian and George and the whole team here at IRD for your hospitality. Thanks, everyone, for turning out to this event. We're really excited to see how full of a room we have here. Sorry to all of you guys who can be standing, but I think that that says something about the vigor of Protestantism in public life here in D.C. So we're very excited to be part of that at the Davenant Institute, resourcing Protestants for thinking critically and in a historically grounded way about how to be good citizens and faithful Christians in a society where those are no longer the same thing. Now, the title of this book, of course, is a somewhat tongue-in-cheek in the sense that we all hear a lot, most of us at least have heard of Catholic social teaching. Nobody probably to date has heard of Protestant social teaching. And arguably, you could argue the title is a misnomer because the Protestants do not have a single teaching office the way the Roman Catholic Church is. We do not have a magisterium. We don't have one source, one living source to whom you can go and say, what is Protestant social teaching? But of course, in practice, just because Catholics have the Pope does not mean that they all agree on what Catholic social teaching is. Far from it. And we would like to argue that there is a coherent tradition of Protestant social thought, Protestant social reflection on what the Scriptures and what reason and what church history have to say about the role of the citizen. There is a coherent tradition to be recovered, and it's the task of this book to recover it. And we think that this is particularly important because America was founded very much as a Protestant nation, right? Thank you. Amen. So, of course, there were a couple of Catholics there at the founding. There was tolerance for Roman Catholics, but there's no question that the DNA of this country, the political DNA, the institutions, the laws, were anchored in a in Protestant social imaginary and Protestant assumptions about the nature of government and the role of the Christian citizen. And that continues to inform and shape the structures of American society, and it certainly continues to be the case in even though Catholicism is, of course, far more vibrant in America now than it was at the time of the founding. Still, religion in America is far and away disproportionately Protestant. In fact, Roman Catholicism in America, as I like to say, is really, Protestantism with the Pope, Protestants who like Mary. Okay, Roman Catholicism in America has been deeply, deeply shaped by its Protestant context and is not the same thing as Roman Catholicism was in the Old World. So if there is to be a retrieval and renewal of what the American experiment was intended to achieve, that renewal is going to have to depend upon a renewal of a politically engaged, historically rooted Protestantism. Catholics are very dominant in the conservative movement and conservative think tanks. We're very grateful for all the work that they are doing, trying to plug the holes in the sinking ship. But ultimately, the ship that they're trying to plug holes in is a Protestant ship, and Protestants need to get their act together if this country is going to have a future. So, this book is an attempt to contribute to that by digging into our heritage and drawing on the scriptures, drawing on the work of church fathers and medievals as Protestants. Although scriptures are highest norm, that doesn't mean that Protestants ignore the contributions of the first 15 centuries of church history. Far from it. And this volume, I think you'll see engagement with key thinkers throughout the first 15 centuries of the church's history, but also centrally an engagement with the work of the magisterial reformers in the 16th century and their heirs in the 17th century, and then bits and pieces of some Protestant thinkers on down to the present day, as well as some constructive work, thinking about what does a Protestant social ethic look like today under new modern conditions. So I think this book is really, you'll find it very diverse in its sources, anchored in the scriptures, anchored in the Reformation, but with an appropriate Protestant eclecticism, drawing the best of wisdom throughout church history. Now, my own chapter is titled The Civil Magistrate, which is, of course, a central part of any social theory is going to have to understand what is the role of government and how should Christians relate to government. And I just want to highlight a few themes in my chapter that I think particularly speak to the needs of the present moment. So I kick off my discussion with this quote from John Calvin. It says, "No one ought to doubt that civil authority is a calling not only holy and lawful before God, but the most sacred and by far the most honorable of all callings in the whole life of mortal men." Now, this is a very jarring statement, I think, to many modern Americans and many conservatives in particular. We've kind of grown up on slogans like that government is best, which governs least. The government is the problem, not the solution. Grover Norquist saying his goal was to shrink government to where it could be drowned in a bathtub, right? So government is bad. That's what we as Americans and conservatives think. And yet the reformers had these very, very positive things to say about the role of government, the role of civil authority in human life. And I think in part that's a result of we take the blessings of government so much for granted. We're the beneficiaries of centuries and centuries of relatively stable, peaceful, free governments in the way that the Reformers were not. The Reformers knew that chaos was always, that society was always just a couple steps away from descending into chaos. And it's easy for us to just look around and think that, peace and harmony and the free market and all that stuff, just happens. And the problem with government's just getting in the way. When in fact, many of these things that we enjoy are the result of good government over a long period of time. And if we take that for granted and we forget the difference between good government and bad government, many of these things that we depend on are no longer going to be there. So the Reformers emphasize government as a God-given gift. And I think this is an important thing to recover this, this moment in politics when there's a lot of talk about the realignment on the right and a new right and post-liberalism and these ideas among conservatives realizing that it's not enough anymore to just talk about government as the problem, getting government out of the way, that we actually have to step up and have a positive vision of the role of government in creating the conditions necessary for the pursuit of the common good. And I think in this moment when conservatives are rediscovering that, which used to be common knowledge, I think the work of the Protestant Reformers is extremely valuable because these were theologians who were called upon to advise statesmen, who are constantly engaged with the business of politics and needing to think about how the scriptures, how natural law, how the needs of the church related to the task of politics. So this is the first thing I would say. The first thing is to say the Reformers understood the importance of civil authority for creating conditions necessary for the pursuit of the common good in a way that contemporary conservatives have somewhat lost sight of. Now, the second thing to note is when we hear those quotes we hear that quote from Calvin. I give a number of other quotes where the Reformers seem to say these kind of ridiculously over-the-top positive things about the rulers in their day. You're like, well, what's wrong with you sycophants? Don't you know that? I mean, do you really believe this? Are you just bootlickers, or are you that naive to think that rulers are that just? Well, no, they're not. Luther, who has very positive things to say about civil government, also says, a wise prince is a mighty rare bird. Let's see if I have the quote. A wise prince is a mighty rare bird, and an upright prince even rarer. They are generally the biggest fools or the worst scoundrels on earth. Therefore, one must constantly expect the worst from them and look for little good. Okay? So Luther could be very, very pessimistic. But how did they hold these things together? Well, they held it together by distinguishing between the person and the office in a way that I think is really important for us to recover in modern American life, because we live in a time in which, of course, the personal is political, and in which political leaders have for decades now, but increasingly are functioning as celebrities and are trying to imitate the way in which celebrities are supposed to present themselves and supposed to influence people. And so we look to our political leaders as for their personality. We look for them. How good do they look on TV? How friendly do they seem? Or how tough guy do they seem? Depending on what personality type you like, you try to gravitate toward a political leader who embodies that. And we saw this with Obama and Trump, both in their own different ways, really turned the presidential office into sort of a referendum on what you thought of them as a person. And of course, this is very problematic because people, as Luther shows, people always fail us. All of the individual persons who are occupying political office are likely to be scoundrels, and they're likely to let us down in a very big way. And if our idea of political authority is simply invested in this person or this personality, that's going to lead to a kind of an unbalanced approach where we either sort of idolize the person or we get disillusioned by them, and then we have contempt for the person. And if we idolize the person, we also idolize the office. And if we have contempt for the person, we have contempt for the office. And what the Reformers tried to emphasize is there's a God-given office which has an intrinsic authority that needs to be respected and preserved, however bad the person occupying that office is. And in fact, the way in which you hold bad leaders accountable is by constantly pointing back to the sanctity of the office that they hold. And I think it's very important. It's easy for us to get drawn into this personalization of politics that we see around us. But I think it's very important for us as Christians and conservatives to recover this reformational understanding of the distinction between person and office. Two other points I'll make really quick. Again, as I said, conservatives have for a few decades kind of outsourced a lot of their thinking to libertarians. It seemed like we could make common cause with libertarians against a common foe, and so we just kind of let libertarians do most of the theorizing for us, not realizing that ultimately it's a very different vision of the human person and the nature of political community. So I think that as conservatives are rediscovering an authentically conservative understanding of the positive role of government in pursuing the common good, again, the Reformers are a great resource for us. In my chapter, I talk about the example of Martin Bucer, who wrote a treatise, De Regno Christi, on the kingdom of Christ, that was basically a advice to young Edward VI, King of England, saying, here's all the policies that you should implement. And it's great, because it's like he runs the gamut from like, here's what you need to do to train better theologians and preachers, to here's what you need to do to maximize wool production in England's sheep regions, right? But it's interesting. He ties it together. The bit about wool production, or actually, sorry, I should go back. He doesn't want to maximize wool production. That's what's going on. Is there is an attempt to maximize wool production, and he's saying this is a problem because we're turning over all of this farmland that could be used to feed people, and could be used to employ laborers, and we're turning it over to sheep pasture, which doesn't require many laborers and doesn't produce food. And so there was a massive unemployment problem and a massive food shortage problem. But the landowners were getting very rich off of the wool exports. And Bucer says, no, we need to understand that the purpose of an economy is the purpose of an economy is human flourishing. The purpose of an economy is to provide good jobs and sustenance for the citizens of the country, so that, and it's tied in with a spiritual good, he says, so that there may be as many good men everywhere who call on the name of the Lord. So basically, Bucer's theory is, our end goal is we want as many people in the kingdom of heaven as possible. Okay, so that requires evangelism and preaching and so on. But it also means we need to have a lot of people to start with, right? I mean, you want to maximize the population on earth as a prerequisite to maximizing the population on heaven. If you want to maximize the population on earth, you need good agricultural and industrial policy to make sure people have good jobs and can raise lots of kids. Right? So a kind of integrated Christian conservative theory of the common good. So finally, I think what we are seeing at this cultural moment is that it is there are things that we sort of imagined for a while that it was possible to have a naked public square, to have a just totally religiously neutral public square. But the only reason it was possible to imagine that was because our public square was, in fact, still haunted by the ghost of Christianity. It looked like an empty, naked public square, but in fact, Christianity was still a force creating the expectations and the norms within which our laws and public institutions operated. And as that is increasingly giving way to what I think Joshua Mitchell has sort of rightly diagnosed as a kind of heretical, but sort of heretical mutation of evangelical religion, which is the kind of religion of wokeness. What we're seeing is a new religiosity taking hold of our public institutions, and a religiosity that is increasingly hostile to the culture that has been formed historically by the Christian religion. So it's no longer enough. We cannot just kind of nod toward generally agreed upon liberal norms of neutrality and civility. We actually have to have a substantive vision of the human good grounded upon an understanding of what it means for humans to be created in the image of God and to be under the kingship of Christ. And that does not mean reestablishing a theocracy. It doesn't mean that we need to go back to the kind of church establishments, the very close relationship of church and state that you saw in the Protestant Reformation. But it does mean that we need to think seriously about the religious preconditions for a just society, and understand that, in fact, a just society has to be ordered toward, as Augustine said, how could there be justice? If justice is giving to everyone his due, how can there be justice in a society that's not giving God his due? And the Reformers thought very seriously about how that relationship is supposed to work. How can a society be ordered toward the highest good in a way that still allows, that is not in this sort of top-down way that was achieved by the medieval papacy, where you have a supreme earthly guardian trying to sort of make sure that every society is ordered toward the highest good. The Reformers rejected that. They wanted a more bottom-up arrangement. They wanted freedom within each society to figure out what the conditions, what the institutions should look like within that society to integrate the temporal and the spiritual good. But they still understood those two were tightly integrated. And I think that wisdom is urgently needed for us today. So I cover all those bases briefly in my chapter. And if you're interested in those themes, I'd also particularly commend to you our book that we published last year called A Protestant Christendom, which we've got on the book table over there. So I've probably gone over my time, so I'm going to hand it off to Marc.
All right, thank you everybody for doing this. Thank you for coming. I promised you, those of you who were here earlier at the NatSec conference, that this would be sort of part two. So this is sort of part two. My chapter is on just war within Protestant social teaching, and it sounds like a discrete topic, like a very specific topic, and in some ways it is. But in this brief sort of introduction to that chapter, I want to propel us toward the notion that in light of the rest of the book, the topic of just war isn't actually all that discrete, but it shares a large degree of affinity with the rest of the topics. But I'm going to start in Poland, and specifically in the town of Oświęcim in southwest Poland, which is probably better known by the German name of Auschwitz. And I'm going to get a little autobiographical. I introduced the chapter with a little bit of autobiography. We don't all have to bring autobiography tonight, but if you'd like to, we could take it in the Q&A. Here I was, you can imagine me, sort of a dying atheist, right? I kind of knew the whole thing about God and the gospel and all that was true. I wasn't terribly keen on it being true, and so I went overseas to try to get out of my comfort zone and avoid the whole conversion thing. So as I said, I was an atheist, so I hadn't read the book of Jonah. I didn't know you couldn't go overseas and avoid God, right? And then I did a dangerous thing. I go to Auschwitz, and a part of the deeper background is I was becoming a Christian through a study of the Holocaust, because here I am encountering what I could only term enormous evil. And I was challenged by a Christian friend that I had no category to adjudicate evil, right, from goodness, from anything else. It was just my opinion. And I wanted my fist shaking at Auschwitz to be saying something about Auschwitz and not just my opinion. All right, so in the words of Os Guinness, God damn it, for me, God damn this place, was an unwitting prayer. I didn't know it, but it was the first prayer I ever really gave. But here I am. It's the 50th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau, and I was there with a friend at the ceremonies commemorating this event. And at the end of the formal ceremonies, they committed to reading all of the names of the lost until all of those names were exhausted. And this is a little bit of a hypothetical because we don't have all the names of the estimated 1.2 million lives that were taken in Auschwitz. But if we imagine that we did, and if we imagine that they read all 1.2 million names, I wanted to know after that ceremony how long that reading of names continued, because it was there long after I left. I was there for several hours. The names are being read over the loudspeaker. I walk away following the tracks back to town. The names are, dwindling away in the distance. So how long did it take to read 1.2 million names? And I worked it out over a beer in a Polish pub with a friend who was better at math than I am. And we estimated the following, that if it took 1 second to read one name, so 1.2 million seconds works out to 13.8 days. All right? 13.8 days, almost a fortnight of an unbroken litany of lost lives. And here I am, an atheist, with no categories to adjudicate any of this. But I want somebody to fix this. And I want a system of thought that's capable of helping me understand how it is that as a responsible human being who wants to love my neighbor, I can contribute to fixing this toward that human flourishing that Brad has talked about. Right? What can I do? I didn't sort of know it at the time, but I was encountering what I've heard since called the naive impression of evil. And naive here isn't a pejorative like it is for us. Naive here is in the old French original word, which means something that's untutored or something that's untaught. You don't need to be told this thing, you just know it. So the naive impression of evil is made up of 3 things. I discuss it, I think, here. I might not. If I didn't, I should have. Bad editing if I didn't do that. It's made up of 3 overlapping but distinct things. It's made up of an awareness first that something that ought not to be is. Something that ought not to be is. We call that evil, right? The second thing is that we prefer what ought to be over what ought not to be. So we prefer goodness over evil. This is just innate, right? I saw it in my 2-year-old when he first experienced a punch on the playground. He just knew this should not be, right? And I knew it too, and I made the other kid aware of it. I'll tell you that. So there's an awareness of what ought not to be but is. There's a preference for what ought to be. And then hard on the heels of both, there's a desire that strikes like tinder and desires remedy. I want somebody to fix this, right? So I didn't know it at the time, but there, with this idea and this desire for remedy, was my own political theology developing long before I became a Christian. All right, and I think that at the heart of political theology, it's trying to ask that question. What went wrong? Who can fix it? When? Right? That's the heart of it. These are the essential questions. So to make a long story short, in the book, I begin talking about the responsibilities of being made in the image of God, as Brad talked about. What does it mean to exercise dominion, which is providential care? So hence we don't have it here, hence the name of the magazine, Providence. Right? It's providential care over creation, right? What does it mean to exercise this kind of responsibility for our world? What is the role of government in it? Brad touched on this. What is the role in light of government and human beings as God's vice regents? What is human responsibility? How is human responsibility, as I touched on today, how is human responsibility enacted when goods seem to conflict, right? So what do we do? And into this tradition, or this series of questions, comes the just war tradition as a way of adjudicating when it is right to use force to overcome evil, how it is that human beings, acting both faithfully and responsibly, ought to use this force in ways that generate more good than harm, and as ways that are faithful to Scripture. What do we do with this? So the Hebraic tradition is just a ground for helping human beings be responsible within the context of history. So all of this is a conundrum, of course. The just war tradition sanctions war, but the problem is that somebody has to fight it. And so the question that I'm often asked when I talk about just war, people will ask me, how can you, a Christian, sanction killing somebody made in the image of God? How do you do that? And it's a good question. It's an essential question. But I've learned to turn the question around and say that's not actually the interesting question. The interesting question is, what am I supposed to do as a Christian when one image of God is kicking in the face of another image of God, and they will not stop, right? So what do I do as a Christian to prevent 14 days of names? Or what do I do about that? I know that I am supposed to love both the guy kicking in the face of the neighbor and the neighbor getting his face kicked in, right? I know I'm supposed to love both of them. This is clear. I know that it's also not enough to say, okay, well, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to love the one neighbor, let's call him the enemy neighbor, later, and I'm going to love the innocent neighbor now. Like, that's not acceptable, right? I'm supposed to love both of them in the same moment at the same time. but it's pretty clear I can't love them both in exactly the same way, in exactly the same time. So into that conundrum comes the just war tradition to try to help us work all that out. I do a 30,000-foot overview with a history of just war teaching, starting very briefly with the Greco-Roman classical heritage, moving in through Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, who talks about the goods of government. And then, naturally, I rest within the Reformation. I go over some of the key figures that are there. I make a distinction a little bit, or identify a distinction between maybe Martin Luther and John Calvin. And it's a distinction that was operative then, and I think it's a distinction that is operative now within Protestant thinking about social teaching, and particularly about war. You could see it in Martin Luther's bifurcation of the two kingdoms, right? There's the spiritual kingdom. It's ruled by the Holy Spirit. There's the temporal kingdom, which is all about the restraint of the wicked, and that sometimes these kingdoms are in tension, right? But that Christians acting responsibly and lovingly submit to the rules of the government out of love for their neighbors. So there's love and there's fidelity, and that's a good thing. But in doing so, they might sometimes have to do things that ought never to be done for the sake of obedience to the king and of love for their neighbor. Right? But this whole doing of things that ought not to be done results in a certain tension, I think, within Martin Luther, that sometimes you do things that ought never to be done because they are necessary to be done. Right? And that's a tension that I'll illuminate in just a moment. And then against that, you've got John Calvin, who sees maybe a tighter or less of a tension between Christian obedience to the king, because Christian obedience to the king, if it results in the saving of our neighbors' lives, is a positive good. It's not a negative good. In this sense, he says there's no moral difference between murder and failing to save someone from murder when you would be able to. Right? So he sees it as a positive good without the tension maybe that Martin Luther had. And you fast forward to today, and within a lot of just war teaching, there's maybe what we would call the Niebuhrian stream, and I touched on this earlier today if you were there, where Reinhold Niebuhr, I'll sometimes say provocatively, Reinhold Niebuhr was a pacifist. And if you know Reinhold Niebuhr, you might be surprised in me couching him this way, because it was Reinhold Niebuhr almost alone that pushed the mainline churches into supporting the war against Hitler and Japanese militarism. So how can I say that a man like him was a pacifist? Well, it's because he was. But why do I think he was, or why do I identify that he was? He had two laws that were operative, and they might remind you of some of the bifurcations that Luther made. But he believed that operative on Christians was the law of love. And this is the law that you see in the Gospels. This is the law of Jesus. And the law of love isn't nonviolence. It's non-resistance. He thinks to resist evil in any way is a violation of the law of love. Right? You could get more into that in Q&A, or you could just read the chapter and see it illuminated. Set against that law of love is a competing law, which is the law of responsibility. And this is where, given the conditions of the world, you have to act responsible for the welfare of your neighbor and the welfare of your neighbor's neighborhood. But these two laws are in tension. But Niebuhr recognized that if you pursue the law of love, given the conditions of the world, you're never going to get love. And you're going to probably bail out on responsibility as well. But if you pursue responsibility, and you season it with love where you can, you'll get a degree of responsibility, and you might get some love thrown in. So he went with the law of responsibility, believing Christians should act responsibly in the world, fighting Hitlerism, fighting Japanese militarism. But that, like Luther, came at a tremendous cost. And the cost was the incurment of guilt and sin. He believed you could not act responsibly in history without staining your soul, dirtying your hands, and incurring guilt. I close the chapter by reflecting on the tragedy and the crisis of this in light of what we now understand to be called moral injury. Moral injury is a proposed subset of post-traumatic stress disorder. And within war fighters, moral injury manifests when one does or allows to be done something that goes against a deeply held moral belief. And too many American Christians are growing up with the belief that killing is wrong, period. But in war it is necessary. And so you get this love, responsibility, tension. Right? And so the very business of war fighting becomes morally injurious. And the reason this is the crisis is that moral injury is the #1 predictor for soldier suicide. So our veterans are dying by their own hands long after firefights are over because they believe that what they have done makes them incompatible with the life that a holy God calls them to. And so in here, I go through solutions to this from Protestant political thought, and I try to help, I try to bring us to a point where we recognize that there is no distinction between the law of love, the law of responsibility. They could be coterminous. It's in this sense that I don't think that my chapter is particularly discrete. As I read through the book, I realize that this is just an overarching theme that appears again and again and again. One of the questions about Christians as we move through life is how to duty and prudence, or faith and responsibility, how do they intersect, right? How do we move responsibly but also faithfully through this world? The just war tradition is not new moral legislation. In fact, if you go through the just war criteria and you think about, for instance, a surgeon contemplating cutting off the leg of a child with gangrene, you would see the same things in effect. Is he a proper authority? Does he have the wherewithal to make that kind of decision? Is there an appropriate cause for doing this operation? Right, well, there is. There's the gangrene. Does he have the right intention, the child's health? Right, and you go through, and then you go through the prudential criteria. Is it the last resort? Is it proportionate? Right, do I have a probability of success? As you move through any conflict between moral goods, you begin to recognize the outline of the just war tradition. And so I think that becomes a framework that I see throughout various chapters. How do we move faithfully through this world, and at the same time being responsible, loving both our God and our neighbor? And I'm going to leave it there. The rest of it's in the book. So, then.
Wow, thank you for coming tonight, everyone. It's fun to see a big crowd here for this. So my name's Jake Meador. I wrote a chapter on ecological care for the book. What I actually would like to do, managing editor privilege, I guess, is talk a little bit more about the need for this project as a whole, and then maybe try to use my essay at the end as one example of what that can look like when applied to a certain question. So as we think about the whole concept of Protestant or Catholic social teaching, think about where that began. The first Catholic encyclical that's part of this corpus is Rerum Novarum, 1891, I think, if I remember right. And though it's forgotten now, at the same time that Pope Leo is developing Rerum Novarum and some of his other encyclicals, there are Protestants that are working on similar problems. You can look at kind of Gilded Age Calvinism as this attempt at a response to some of these issues that arise with industrialization, with the early failure of European Christendom, with the emergence of more nation states in Europe. All of these questions that are bubbling up, Protestants are thinking about them too at the same time. Abraham Kuyper, notably, is probably the most famous name. He's working on these issues at the same time as Leo. Herman Bavinck, another name that's thankfully becoming more prominent, another contemporary of Leo's, trying to address very similar problems. So we're not even having to just reach back 500 years when we talk about Protestant social teaching. We have more contemporary resources to draw on as well. Much of this wasn't able to develop over time because Kuyper and Bavinck, and actually B.B. Warfield as well, for those who know their American church history, they all die within 18 months of each other. And between that and World War I and the Depression and World War II, it doesn't get to build. But the point I want to highlight is that these teachings emerge in response to what you might kind of call a gray zone dynamic, where this old era is clearly winding down, something new is emerging, and we don't know what that's going to be yet. And so within that context, the church kind of finds itself asking these questions. You know, we haven't had to think about industrialism before. What does that mean for workers? Or what does that mean for wages? The civil magistrate is now morphing into this state entity. What does that mean for our relationship to the government? These are new questions that arise, and Christians, guided by the Spirit, guided by Scripture, gather together to think together about how we answer them. And so what I'm really excited about with this project is it's an attempt for us at Davenant to try and bring to bear the many resources of the Catholic faith across time and of the magisterial tradition as we deal with our own gray zone moment. This is now, I think, that you can make a good argument that we're entering a new gray zone, where we now have a land war in Eastern Europe, we have a one-man state in China, we have rapidly falling birth rates, we have all of these kind of crisis points all bubbling up at the same time, and so now again we're asking some of these same questions. What does Christian faithfulness look like in this context? And so what I hope the Protestant Social Teaching Project can do is it can provide resources for ordinary Christians facing these issues. One of kind of the unhappy things about American Christianity in recent years is that amongst a lot of Orthodox Protestants, you had a faith that was, and now I'm quoting Os Guinness, privately engaging, publicly irrelevant, is the way I've heard him describe what a lot of evangelical thought was after the fundamentalist modernist split. And then you could also turn to Rome for help, and yet Catholic social teaching is going to presuppose a number of theological points that for Protestants don't apply and that they would reject. And so interested Protestants trying to think through these problems have not always had the resources they need to think clearly about them. So our hope for this project is that it would furnish people with the intellectual resources they need to discern principles of reality and then discuss those intelligently with their friends, their neighbors, and to follow Christ in their callings, whatever those might be. Obviously in DC there's a certain subset of what that will look like. It looks different where I'm from in Nebraska, but the underlying principles remain the same, creation remains the same, God remains the same, and so we try to faithfully follow God into the world. I actually think there's a potentially very powerful evangelistic impulse here as well. One of the things that happens when you live in a gray zone is gray zones produce anxiety. And that makes sense. Where does anxiety come from? It comes from not knowing who I am. It comes from not knowing what's going to happen next, not knowing what I am supposed to do. These are very common feelings that a lot of people are wrestling with now. And what we can do to model a better way in a moment like this is we can be what a pastor, Mark Sayers is his name, and I think he gets this from Edwin Friedman, if I remember right. We can model what's called a non-anxious presence. We can model the sense of calm and quiet trust in God that is obviously different from the frantic pace, from the rage, from the just general chaos of our moment. But if we are to embody that non-anxious presence for our neighbors and our churches, we need to know what is true, and we need to live according to what is true. And so those are the hopes that I think we all have for this project, is that it would help people to do that. We don't have all the contributors here tonight, obviously, but Stephen Wedgeworth's essay on abortion is one of the most thorough treatments of how churches addressed abortion in the 20th century I've ever read. There's a number of incredibly helpful essays here that I hope and trust will change the way you think about a lot of issues. So for my own essay, I was thinking about environmental care and how the Protestant Reformation and early reformers who weren't really thinking about environmental care in the way we are, this side of industrialism, how can they help us think about these problems today? And so the two thinkers I spent the most time working with in the essay are Martin Bucer, who's already, well, they've both already been mentioned, Martin Bucer, and John Calvin, who actually studied under Bucer for a few years in Strasbourg, was mentored by him. Bucer actually introduced him to his wife, kind of pressured him to marry her because Calvin didn't want to get married. Kind of in keeping with what Brad was saying, actually, about some of Bucer's views. So what Bucer does that I think is very instructive, and it can help us in thinking about environmental care, because so often environmental rhetoric and concerns can almost flag human beings as kind of a parasite on creation. And really, everything would just be better if we weren't here at all. Bucer can give us a better starting point to think about a positive account of human life in the created world. This is telling of Bucer. His last work is De Regno Christi. His first work is Instructions in Christian Love. this question of love and public life and neighbor just runs through everything that Bucer does. It's kind of the beating heart of his theology. And when he's talking in Instructions in Christian Love about what this looks like, he again gets extremely practical. So there's even one section, apologies, some in the room who this might, where he says, you should encourage your children to be farmers because farming is the most immediately helpful thing you can do for your neighbor with the least harm to your neighbor. And you should not encourage your children to go into business. Like, this is a paraphrase of a discussion he has in there, which we can argue with all we want, but it's telling of how practical he wants to get in thinking about how do we love our neighbor well. So one thing that Bucer talks about there is the relationship to land. And here's what he writes. This is the quote that kind of stuck with me ever since I first read it years ago. So this is Bucer, quote, "With the loss of the knowledge of God, we have lost also the knowledge of creatures. As we no longer wish to live to serve God, his creatures were rightly taken away from our service. If we ignore the Creator, it is fair that we are deprived also of the created. We have followed Satan and despised God, hence our whole mind has been perverted to the point that it can no longer be useful to anyone, but rather has become so universally harmful that we have deserved for ourselves eternal condemnation. Thus the whole creation, which should have been used only to the praise and glory of its Creator and for the preservation and profit of men, has been disgraced, profaned, and depraved by our diabolic misuse and self-seeking." So, and if you follow Bucer here, this is an idea that you can certainly trace out through the Old Testament. The giving of land is a sign of blessing. The taking away of land is a sign of judgment. This is the story of Israel in the Old Testament. When God promises to bless Abraham, he promises him land. And so Bucer's just picking up on this theme. And you can, sorry, trying to condense just for time's sake. I think something we can take into our reflection on ecology from this is that there are root sins that we maybe think about in terms of only interpersonal terms or communal terms. They often have an ecological impact as well, and judgment can also have an ecological element to it. You could even think about this with something like the Genesis flood. This is a move Michael Williams makes in his book Far as the Curse is Found to suggest that there is an ecological element to the flood as an element as judgment. And so that kind of core insight from Bucer, the land exists for the common use of all, for the blessing of neighbor, and this should be reflected in the actual way we treat the land. That's not an insight unique to the magisterial tradition, but I think it's something that the magisterial tradition can give us. The other person I use, an argument I want to make in the chapter, or I do make in the chapter, it's written, is, I think, unique to the magisterial tradition. And it comes from Calvin and also a little bit from Bucer, but more Calvin. So think about, if you're familiar with the debates about Eucharistic presence in the Reformation era, what the magisterial tradition ends up saying is that God is spiritually present with us in the Lord's Supper. And so the bread and wine remain bread and wine, and yet that is the means through which Christ unites himself to us, through which God discloses his presence to us, almost even kind of catches us up with him into heaven as we feast at the Lord's table. This is probably not the way you hear the Eucharist talked about in Reformed churches often, unfortunately, but it should be. But what I want to draw out here, and this is something Brad's written about as well, actually, in the past, is that, so there's this meme that goes around that talks about how Protestants can't write well or can't make good art because we have this very underdeveloped creational theology. But if you actually follow the logic of our Eucharistic theology, I think you have to turn that on its head. For Rome, in order for us to be united to Christ in the Eucharist, the bread and wine actually have to become the body and blood of Christ. But for the Protestants, or for the magisterial folks anyway, we're united to God through actual bread and actual wine. And so it suggests something about how God can disclose himself to us and communicate to us through nature that is really quite significant, I think, and should affect the way that we see the created world around us. It certainly affected the way Calvin saw it. So here's a long quote from Calvin, but it's so striking, and it so cuts against the kind of like dour-faced Frenchman caricature that often is applied to Calvin. So this is Calvin. In every part of the world, in heaven and on earth, he, God, has written and engraved the glory of his power, goodness, wisdom, and eternity. Truly, as St. Paul said, the Lord never left himself without a witness, even to those to whom he has sent no knowledge of his word. For all creatures, even from the firmament to the center of the earth, could be witnesses and messengers of his glory to all people. For the little singing birds sang of God, the animals acclaimed him, the elements feared and the mountains resounded with him, the rivers and springs threw glances toward him, the flowers and the grasses smiled, so that in truth there was no need to seek him afar, seeing that everyone could find God within himself, inasmuch as we are all sustained and preserved by his virtue abiding in us. So this is Calvin talking about natural theology. But it has really big ecological import, I think. Calvin is saying that the little birds sing to us of God. This is one of the ways he discloses himself to us. They won't sing to us if they aren't there. If the river is dry and barren, the river is not going to glance up toward God because there's no river. And so I think one of the implications of this very, very high view of created reality and of nature that you find in Calvin is that we have a call to care for and protect the beautiful things that God has made so that they can speak to us and so that they can speak to our neighbors who need to hear from God. And they do that chiefly through Scripture, of course, but God discloses himself to us in so many ways. And so what I see Calvin doing here is saying, all of these beautiful things that delight you in nature, that is a form of God speaking to you and telling you about himself. And so as a Christian, I look at that and I'm like, I want to preserve those things. I want them to be protected and to be able to continue to survive and flourish and thrive and tell others about this great God that we serve. And so entailed in this natural theology of Calvin's is, I think, a certain duty that we have toward the natural world that perhaps Calvin didn't have to think about because he didn't have industrial technology and tools that could rip the top off of a mountain, but we do. And so I think there are implications of this theology for us that we can and should try to apply in our own day. That's a very quick summary of my chapter. But yeah, that's what I had for tonight. So thank you so much. Thank you for being here. Oh, we do have 3 chairs. Okay.
Okay, so now we're going to move to a time of questions and answers. So if any of you have questions, there's a microphone right up here on the right. I would invite you to come down, and we can just sort of form a queue for questions. Before we do, well, while you're thinking about your questions, Brad sort of told me that I should throw him a softball. So this is not a, oh, we'll see if it's a hard ball. We're gonna throw it. So Brad asked me to throw him a softball to kind of get him warmed up before he has to sort of deal with you guys. So I just wanted to ask all of you, and all of you actually sort of gestured to this issue in different ways in your talks. But I think in the background of everything you were saying, at least for me as I'm hearing it, there's this sort of question of the almost unimaginable technological transformations that we've undergone since the time of the Reformation. These technological changes and the rise of the contemporary bureaucratic state have altered our relationships to the magistrate. They've transformed how we fight wars. They've transformed our relationship to nature. And I was just wondering if and this is pitched to all of you, so you know, any of you can answer or all of you can. How then should we apply the insights of the Reformation, which were insights from a very different time and place. We can't do a one-for-one application, I would assume, given the sort of radical difference of our own sort of relationship to all of these issues, mediated as they are by technology. So I just wanted to ask if you think that there is a substantive difference, and if so, how then should we do what are the principles by which we should carry out the task of translation?
Sure, yeah. So I was actually talking with someone else here earlier about this. The Reformation is actually a very interesting analog for this moment because of the disruption of the printing press. The printing press is highly disruptive to European life in all kinds of ways. And it creates challenges for the reformers. So Calvin's a very interesting example here because he actually was very resistant to having his sermons published. And the reason for that was because his view was that my sermons are for the church that I am pastoring in Geneva. They're not meant for the church outside of Geneva. I have Bible commentaries I've written for them. My sermons are for Geneva. Now, if you've seen that we have collections of Calvin's sermons, here's why. Enterprising printing or publishers throughout Europe realized I could publish a bundle of sermons, say that they're by John Calvin, and they will sell very well, and I will make a lot of money. And so Calvin had this kind of PR problem for a little while where there were all these sermons being distributed around Europe that had his name on them, and they were not written by him. And so that is the point at which Calvin relents and is like, okay, fine. We will have an official transcriptionist transcribing my sermons in the church. We will print that, and that is the authorized edition of my sermons, and that is what we will do to deal with this problem. So they found ways to kind of innovate in response to new technologies. Intellectual property right laws would fit here, obviously, as ideas that were developed and took time to develop to help figure out, well, what do we do with the fact that now books are really cheap to publish and counterfeiting is highly lucrative? So I think we have resources within the tradition. I think the underlying principles aren't terribly like revolutionary or that difficult. Like going back to what Brad was saying with economics, the world is the Lord's and the fullness therein, and he gives it to us for the common use of all. Rome calls it the universal destination of goods. Dr. Calhoun kind of discusses this a little bit in his chapter. And so we start from that principle, and then we say, well, how do we recognize this truth that the world is for the common use of all in how we think about any number of issues? I think in a similar way here, tools are meant to help humans do good work more effectively. All of those are words that need to get defined, and they should get defined by Christian terms, not libertarian terms or progressive terms. And so we need to think about, well, what is good work understood Christianly? I mean, sorry for the plug. Charlie Clark just wrote an essay on this for Mere Orthodoxy called Good Work. That is very helpful on that, I think. And as far as the tech angle goes, we could do a lot worse than revisiting Ivan Illich and Neil Postman, I think. Illich's tools for conviviality and deschooling society are both fairly essential for this moment, I think. I don't know if you guys...
Thanks, Jake. Do we have...
Can I just come in on that?
Oh, sure, yeah.
So, I mean, on my topic, I think this issue of the change in the context, the change in our technological context, there's a lot to be said. And first, on the point of continuity, I think there are many aspects of our current moment that if we look at the Reformation context, there are aspects of our current moment that we would think there's no analog of Reformation. And in fact, there are some very interesting analogs. I think we're in this moment of a kind of resurgence of nationalism and concern about national self-determination, borders, sovereignty. And it's really interesting to look at the Reformation through that lens and see how much of what was going on in the Reformation was a backlash against the sort of oppressive internationalism of the Roman Catholic Church and the way in which the Pope in Rome, with his bureaucrats all throughout Europe, and his kind of stooges and the various in the monastic orders and then the episcopates and so on, which all of whom, of all the leaders in all the different churches throughout Europe, ultimately were dependent upon this authority way off in Rome, who was his own, he was a political authority too, right? He claimed to be a spiritual authority, but he functioned as a political authority over and above all of these local and coming to see themselves as national political authorities in a way that was seen as this kind of this alien figure trampling on the rights of local self-determination. And so this was a huge part of the impetus in the English Reformation was the sense of we as Englishmen don't have the right to determine our own destiny. This Pope off in Rome with his own agenda is managing our economy, managing our foreign policy, etc. So I think that has a lot of
Germany.
Yeah, in terms, you know, if you look at the whole, it's really interesting to look at the whole indulgence thing through the kind of lens of foreign trade. I think I mentioned this. I talk about this in my chapter in Protestant Christendom. But so issues today about the authority of international institutions or transnational corporations and the way that they are eroding the sovereignty of the nation state are in many ways prefigured by the Reformation debates. Now, so that's the point of continuity. A point of discontinuity, I think, that can be unsettling to people is I talked about the Reformers have this very high view of the civil magistrate and of all the responsibility that they should have in society. You go through all the different things that Bucer wants the ruler to be responsible for. And you're like, my goodness, this guy's not just a socialist, he's like a communist, you know what I mean? He's like total totalitarian. And yet, of course, the state now is far more massive than the state was then. So how do we deal with this paradox? On the one hand, if we were to list what are the legitimate responsibilities of the civil magistrate, it would be a much, much shorter list than their list. And yet, our state seems to be this behemoth, and their state was, you know, quite tiny comparatively. Well, what's happened is, of course, as technology has made it, I mean, Bucer could say, here's all the things the king should do. And the king could do those things, and they would only have a very small effect, you know, in what was happening in, say, North Yorkshire or whatever, right? If any effect. Whereas now, because of technology, it's possible for every state policy to insert itself into every aspect of our lives in this very insidious and totalitarian way. And so we're very hesitant about this idea of, you know, putting our rulers in charge of the common good, in charge of morality, because to us that sounds very oppressive in a way that it didn't to them. And I think there, however, we can find wisdom, particularly from some of the generations shortly after the Reformation, where they realized that it was important to consolidate power in the rising national state over against this transnational bureaucracy of the papacy. But there had to be counterweights to state power within the nation as well, to prevent it becoming totalitarian. And this is where the Reformed political theorist Johannes Althusius is very neglected, but tremendously insightful. And he kind of develops this whole understanding of, I mean, we now refer to it as subsidiarity. Catholics claim credit for it, but Althusius is the one who outlined it. This whole idea that the state is a community of communities, and its oversight of the common good has to be mediated through the common goods of all these particular institutions, churches, families, businesses, bowling leagues, etc. All of these things are part of what make up the common good of society. You have to have this kind of rich consociational pluralism is what it was called by some Althusius commentators. So again, I guess this is turning into more of a plug for other books, which is good. I have a few copies of it. But I have more about this in my essay in Protestant Christendom as well. But start with Protestant Social Teaching, because that's what we have all the copies of.
Great. All right, the microphone is open for people who are interested in asking questions. Would you like to ask?
So short. Well, I'm first, so I suppose I have to say something inflammatory. I'll try to avoid that. First off, thank you very much for your presentations. I enjoyed them all thoroughly. And thank you for reminding us that social teaching, Christian social teaching, is far broader than what is contained in a handful of letters by superannuated Italians and a Pole and a German. And I say that as a convinced Catholic. The social teaching of the Church is unfortunately confined to a particular social and political climate and a particular period of time when, in fact, the tradition itself is a good deal more interesting, I think, than the letters are often themselves. My question was going to be about sacraments, actually, before they were even brought up. So any of you could field this. Dr. Littlejohn, I know you've written on this. I think that Dr. Littlejohn's essay, Reformed Sacramentology, is the best argument against the Catholic Church I've ever read. I mean, I really do. I really do. I don't think it works. I think there's it was pretty troubling. There's something in it, a very small, what I would say is a flaw, that unravels it. But that's something else. At any rate, I'd like you to address, certainly from the Protestant perspective, the Protestant sacramentology, an Orthodox thinker, Vladimir Soloviev, brilliant Orthodox philosopher. He wrote a book called Russia and the Universal Church, a short text, very interesting. At the end of it, he gives an exposition of the 7 sacraments, or the 7 mysteries. He was Orthodox, so they have at least 7 mysteries. And I won't summarize it now, but he attaches an impetus of social responsibility to each one of the sacraments. So briefly, baptism, confirmation, and Eucharist, or he associates them with liberty, equality, fraternity. And then he gives the sacrament of penances for the reconciliation of society. And then the 3 remaining sacraments, holy orders, matrimony, and for him, extreme unction, are for the reconciliation of various aspects of social life, man and woman, society as a whole, man and his end with death. So I'm wondering, you've provided a broad picture of Protestant social teaching here, but how does that, especially in the light of Protestant sacramentology, how does that speak directly to the lives and the works of individuals? How is that, and how is that mediated? If you could just speak on that. Thank you.
Well, I think one thing briefly to be said on that is I do think it is unfortunate that in rejecting those other 5 sacraments as sacraments, that Protestantism over time came to sort of reject any sacramentality to them at all, which I think we don't see that in the early reformers. In the Anglican tradition in particular, there are many Anglicans now who would actually speak again of 7 sacraments. I think I wouldn't do that because I think it's just historically unfaithful to the way the reformers, including the early English reformers, spoke. But I think they did understand that the 2 sacraments were unique because they were instituted by Christ and they were for all believers in a way that the other 5 were not. But that didn't mean that those other 5 did not have a sacramental dimension to them, that they were not mysteries that in which nature and grace were brought together in some special way, in which the fact that as Jake was saying, I think in the Protestant view, actually more faithfully than the Catholic, the stuff of everyday life is transformed into a site for God's presence, a place for becoming Christ to the world, becoming Christ to your neighbor. And I think that is understood and emphasized in the early Protestant tradition in the way that they think about, for instance, marriage, and the way they think about the role of the ordained ministry. In the way that confirmation is not, it is practiced in Anglican communion, but something like it is practiced in other Protestant communities. Understanding that there's this kind of there's a coming of age at which the grace acknowledged in baptism needs to be owned, and so that the grace is intersecting with every phase of life: birth, coming to adulthood, marriage, death. I would say the last extreme mention is maybe the place where Protestants have been weakest, and I think that's partly there was such a cult of the way that the cult of the saints and the Catholic understanding of purgatory and the afterlife had become so corrupted in their minds, made them extremely wary of, again, outside the Anglican tradition has a good funeral service. This is one thing that Richard Hooker is usually having to defend. The Puritans wanted to get rid of the funeral service because they just felt like these funerals were sort of inherently tended to superstition. So the Reformers were afraid of superstition, and in some cases that led them to shy away from a proper recognition of the spiritual dimension of these aspects of temporal life. I think their theology gets it right. I think their practice didn't always get it right because they were so wary of superstition. And I think the irony is that wariness of superstition may have made sense in the first few decades, but then the natural thing to do would then be to say, okay, now we've kind of cured the people of superstition. Our people are not praying, gravesides anymore. So now we can actually bring some of these things back because they're not as dangerous anymore. But instead, what happened is often instead of coming back, they actually, the sacramentology in Protestant churches got weaker and weaker and weaker, and so now it's largely absent. So I think Protestants have not had good resources for thinking theologically about death and funerals. I think that's the one essay we have in there on death and dying is a very good contribution to recovering that. So long-winded way, I think theologically we have good resources for thinking about the sacramentality of all of life. I think we haven't always gotten that right in our actual practice and liturgiology, and that's something we can improve on.
One thing I'll say, just in terms of the just war chapter, we know that the violence of war shatters souls, and more than the violence that a warfighter experiences, it's the violence that a warfighter does, right? And so, if Protestants in particular don't maybe recover, I think some communities have it, but if generally speaking we don't recover a better understanding of confession and penance and ways of seeking absolution, then we're going to lose generations of warfighters. So it has to be recovered.
Can you guys hear us in the back? Okay.
I would just also add Alan Calhoun's essay in here on taxation and welfare. Actually, one of the headings is the liturgy after the liturgy, which is what he's using to kind of describe the Lutheran approach that grows out of Luther's thought to welfare. Providing for the poor through a collective action was seen as a natural outflowing of the liturgy in the Lutheran Church, which isn't exactly what you're talking about. But so Calhoun's essay touches on some of that.
Can I just say something very briefly? I know I'm not supposed to actually be talking, but also Calhoun wrote an essay for us in a different book, the Protestant Christendom book, in which he talks about how Luther's institution of poor relief in churches, which is sort of proto-welfare, the sort of first ecclesial-centric institution of poor relief, is explicitly modeled on his Eucharistic theology. So there's a sort of an instance in which Luther's sacramental theology is directly impacting his sort of his vision of social life. So that might be another place to look. Yes.
Well, the essay he was alluding to on Reformed sacramentology is actually published on Mere Orthodoxy. It's called The Real Presence and the Presence of Reality, if you want to look that up.
You can play Where's Waldo as you look for the flaw.
Any other people interested in asking a question?
I'll ask my question even though it was sort of stolen by the first question. But I know you talked about how technology has made the state bigger compared to what the reformers imagined. And I just sort of wanted to ask a question about the way that the beginning of this talk was framed as turning away from a kind of libertarian framing. And I suppose my question is, to what extent the libertarian framing that we have today is a far more accepting of even a broader role for the state than would have been expected in the 16th century. Now, this was talked about a little bit but I just wonder if there's any sort of tension between, I'm not a libertarian, don't worry, but but if there's any sort of tension between, the reason someone says get the government off my back is because there is actually so much more, quote unquote, government than there would have been in, say, a 14th century Hamlet or such. So I wondered if you could just talk about that on those terms rather than necessarily the technological terms.
Yeah, well, briefly, I mean, this good point I made about Althusius is we have more government on our backs because we have so much less of everything else on our backs, right? We have so much less school and church and family telling us how to live well. All of them are just telling us, follow your dream, follow your heart, do what feels right, which doesn't ultimately work, and so we run into problems, and so then the state has to sort of say, well, don't do what feels right if that feels right to you. Okay. So I think a crucial turn was made. Many people, everyone wants to sort of say this genealogy of modernity, and it all went wrong with Locke, or it all went wrong with Hobbes, or it all went wrong with Luther, or it all went wrong with Duns Scotus, or whatever. And I think an underemphasized turning point much later in the narrative than most people give is John Stuart Mill. Now, of course, his thought doesn't come out of nowhere, but the way he articulates liberty and on liberty is very, very significant, because for him, he's very clear it's not the government, it's not the coercion of the government I'm primarily concerned about. It's the pressure of community. I don't want community telling me the norms that I'm supposed to follow. I want to just be able to be myself and do and follow my own idea of the good. Now, of course, and the problem is, like, John Stuart Mill's idea of the good is like basically 98% the same as like Victorian conformism's idea of the good, right? He thinks that he's really, radical free thinker, but in fact, he's taking for granted this whole enculturation, and you take away that enculturation, and all hell breaks loose. But Mill is really pushing this libertarian idea of I'm supposed to define my own idea of life, universe, and everything, and so that leaves nothing else to constrain me or to reconcile my actions with the common good besides the bureaucratic state. And so if you want to shrink the bureaucratic state, we've got to sort of reinflate all of these other institutions of civil society. And this isn't what my chapter is about, but this is an important part of the book. And it drives me nuts that people think of, if you have a bunch of kids, people are like, oh, you must be Catholic, right? It's like, and there's something called the Institute on Marriage and Family, people are like, oh, it's a Catholic thing, right? And the irony is, of course, the Reformation, it was the Catholics who were saying, yeah, you shouldn't get married, that's kind of sinful, and should vow celibacy for your whole life. And the Reformers were saying, no, we gotta recover marriage and family and childbearing. And so a very, very robust account of the family and its role in the Christian society was a central contribution of Protestant social teaching, and something that we've got to recover if we want to not be libertarian and not be statists. I'm going too much time.
Another piece there. So there's an interview I heard recently. It's on a podcast called Rebuilders. It's with Mark Sayers, who I already mentioned. He does this interview with a missionary working with the church in Iran, which is actually the fastest growing church in the world, which I did not know until I listened to this podcast. But he tells this wild story of this woman who became a Christian, and she's now basically helping plant a church. And her story is she was a pickpocket. That was how she supported her family. One day she steals a bag that doesn't have a wallet in it, but it has a Bible. And she starts reading the Bible, and there's a little card in the Bible that gives her I think it was a Zoom link that she could access to talk to somebody if she wanted to learn more about Christianity. Because it's tricky with evangelization and things like this, religious liberty more generally. And so she ends up reaching out through Zoom and becomes a Christian, and then starts meeting with a Christian. They're pretty careful about identifying who this person was that she was talking to. But meeting with this person over Zoom studying the Bible, basically kind of Christian discipleship 101. And then she starts doing that with other Iranian Christians. And this is one of the ways that the church in Iran is spreading the gospel now, is through the use of Zoom. So I was thinking about this because if you think about the way that we approach a lot of tech in the West, going off of Mill, the good life is about choice maximization. It's about expanding possibilities. There's a great line in Resurrection and Moral Order where O'Donovan makes the argument that we shouldn't be thinking about possibilities, but potency. Freedom is in recognizing the right course and maximizing your gifts according to your nature as given to you by God. And yet all of our technology, or so much of our technology, is built around self-creation and choice maximization. And so one of the questions I'm curious to think about is just, what would it look like to try and use technology in ways that aren't about that? And this example from Iran, so again, the podcast is called Rebuilders, and the title of the episode has something about Iran in it. So listen to that episode, because so much of what God's doing in Iran right now seems to be getting facilitated through digital technology, which, like, as a Wendell Berry lover, is very weird for me to, like, observe. But it seems to be how God's working. And so it's a very interesting counterexample, I think, to how a lot of technology works in the West.
Great, thank you. If someone has a quick question, we might have time for one more, but I think now we're supposed to be moving to the book signing portion of the evening. So if someone has a quick question, yeah. And then we'll, Brad is going to say a few words, and then we'll move to the book signing.
So I'm really interested in the natural law tradition, especially within Protestantism. I'm working on writing a senior thesis on that for my university honors program. Speak up, yeah. So I'm interested in the natural law tradition, especially within Protestantism. I'm working on writing a senior thesis on that for my university honors program, also in coordination with the American Enterprise Institute's Young Scholars Program. One thing I'm interested in, obviously, at least in the last century or so, there's been a lot of Protestant skepticism towards natural law. But one thing I'd like your perspective on is, do you think there are distinctives within Protestantism with the approach to natural law? Obviously, it's been rejected a lot more, but is there anything in particular that Protestants are saying about natural law that Catholics maybe aren't saying, or are the two traditions kind of saying very similar things and there's a lot of overlap there?
Okay. So the question for those who couldn't hear is that Protestantism over the last 100 years has often been seen as rejecting natural law. That's a more recent development. But going back to the Reformers and in the earlier Protestant tradition, are there sort of distinctively Protestant contributions to the natural law tradition? Or are Protestants and Catholics sort of speaking with one voice on natural law?
Just very briefry.
Brad wrote a book on this, so you know.
I'm writing a chapter in a book, Natural Law, 5 Views, for Zondervan. So I'm reforming natural law. So answering this question in part, I don't think it's that different. I think on the whole, the Manchester Reformers took over the traditional natural law tradition. I think there are a few differences of emphasis. Protestants are going to emphasize the effects of sin in distorting our knowledge of natural law. On average, Protestants are going to emphasize that more than Catholics, can be a little bit more pessimistic, are going to lean more on Scripture for kind of expounding the meaning of the natural law without saying, they don't say that the only place you can find the meaning of natural law is Scripture. They're just going to lean on it more. But also, for the Roman Catholic Church, if there are disputes over the meaning of natural law, that's one of the, or different demands of natural law seem to be in conflict, that's one of the tasks of the Pope is to adjudicate that. So it's kind of a top-down system with more of an emphasis on sort of a top-down deductive method. Again, these are rough generalizations. With a top-down adjudicator, Protestants are going to emphasize more the kind of empirical role of traditions within each culture, within each culture's legal tradition, in fleshing out, kind of specifying the natural law for their own historical conditions. And obviously, they're not going to have one adjudicator on earth, right? If there are conflicting understandings between, the Germans think natural law means this, and the English think natural law means that, that's going to have to be adjudicated through diplomacy. And so you have kind of the idea of the law of nations or international law, particularly developed within Protestant thinkers after the Reformation as a way of adjudicating disputes that Roman Catholics could just be sort of passed up to the Pope. So some differences, but I think substantially quite similar.
If you're interested in a really striking book on that, Eric Hutchinson translated a treatise on natural law by Niels Hemmingsen, who was a student of Melanchthon's, Danish Lutheran, late 1500s. It's about a 200-page paperback. I don't remember what press put it out. But Eric Hutchinson's the translator and Hemmingsen is the author, and that will give you a really good, concise overview of how early reformers were thinking about natural law.
All right, thank you guys. Thank you all.